The Cold War is remembered as an ideological and military confrontation between capitalism and communism, between the United States and the Soviet Union, between freedom and totalitarianism. But underneath this political and military struggle was a financial architecture that both enabled Western victory and created the economic structure that still governs the world today. And this financial dimension was deliberately designed, wasn't accidental or emergent, was the product of careful planning by American and British financial and political elites who understood that winning the post-war competition required controlling global finance, required establishing institutions and systems that would make capitalism attractive and communism untenable, required using economic power to bind allies and isolate enemies. And the key institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates centered on the dollar, the Marshall Plan, NATO's economic coordination, the development of the Eurodollar market. All of these were components of a coordinated strategy to use financial power to win the Cold War, to make American economic leadership permanent, to ensure that global commerce flowed through American-controlled channels and in American-backed currencies. And this strategy worked spectacularly. The Soviet Union couldn't compete economically, couldn't offer allies the prosperity and integration that the Western financial system provided, couldn't maintain its empire without the economic resources that market participation would have given it, and eventually collapsed partly from economic exhaustion, from inability to match Western economic performance or to sustain the military spending needed to compete. So the Cold War was won financially as much as militarily or ideologically, and the victory was achieved through deliberately constructed financial institutions and policies that subordinated other countries. Economic sovereignty to American leadership that made the dollar essential to global commerce, that created dependencies and obligations that persist today, and understanding this hidden financial plot reveals that the current global economic order isn't natural or inevitable, but is the product of conscious design, of American financial hegemony established during the 1940s and sustained through the Cold War and beyond, and that challenges to this order, whether from China's Belt and Road Initiative or from attempts to create alternative payment systems or from movements toward de-dollarization. These are challenging not just American power, but the entire financial architecture created specifically to win the Cold War, an architecture that was never disclosed to the public in its full scope, but that shaped and continues to shape the world economy. The planning began before the war ended, in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where American and British negotiators, primarily Harry Dexter White for the U.S. and John Maynard Keynes for Britain, designed the post-war international monetary system. And while the conference was ostensibly about creating stability and preventing the currency chaos that had contributed to the Depression and to war, it was actually about establishing American financial hegemony, about creating institutions that would center the global economy on the dollar and on American-dominated organizations. White's plan, which prevailed over Keynes's more internationalist proposal, created a system where the dollar was linked to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies were linked to the dollar, making the dollar effectively the global reserve currency. Countries needed dollars to engage in international trade, to buy oil and commodities and manufactured goods, and the United States, as the only major economy, with its productive capacity intact after the war, was uniquely positioned to provide dollars through trade and investment, and this gave America enormous power, the ability to run deficits without immediate consequences because other countries needed dollars and would accept them, the ability to inflate or deflate the global money supply through Federal Reserve policy, the ability to impose financial sanctions by denying access to dollars, and crucially, the ability to finance the Cold War by printing money that the rest of the world had to accept because they needed dollars for trade. The IMF and World Bank were created at Bretton Woods as complementary institutions, the IMF to manage short-term balance of payments problems and the World Bank to finance long-term development. But their real function was to extend American influence. Both were headquartered in Washington. Both gave the United States veto power over major decisions. Both imposed conditions on borrowing countries that required market-oriented reforms, privatization, opening to foreign investment, fiscal austerity, conditions that benefited American corporations and investors, and both served as mechanisms for integrating countries into the dollar-based system. for making them dependent on Western finance, for preventing them from pursuing autarkic or socialist economic models. If a country wanted to develop, wanted access to capital for infrastructure or industrialization, it had to go through the World Bank, had to accept IMF supervision of its finances, and this meant accepting American influence over its economic policies, meant opening its economy to American trade and investment, meant joining the Western economic bloc rather than pursuing non-aligned or Soviet-oriented development. So the IMF and World Bank were tools of financial warfare, were means of winning the Cold War by making capitalism attractive and by making non-capitalist development difficult or impossible. The Marshall Plan was explicitly designed as financial weapon in the Cold War. Officially, it was humanitarian aid to rebuild war-devastated Europe, and it did rebuild Europe. But the strategic purpose was to prevent European countries from falling into Soviet orbit, from adopting communist or socialist economic systems out of desperation. The aid came with conditions. Recipients had to cooperate with each other, had to reduce trade barriers, had to adopt market-oriented policies, and had to exclude communist parties from government. And the aid was mostly in the form of dollar credits that could only be used to purchase American goods. So Marshall Plan simultaneously rebuilt Europe, created markets for American exports, integrated European economies with the American economy, and prevented communist expansion. It was brilliant strategy, using economic aid to achieve geopolitical goals. And it worked. Western Europe recovered rapidly, became prosperous, remained firmly in the Western camp, and provided a stark contrast with Eastern Europe, which remained under Soviet control and suffered economic stagnation, demonstrating to the world that capitalism delivered prosperity while communism delivered poverty. And this demonstration effect was perhaps the Marshall Plan's greatest achievement, more valuable than the actual Reconstruction aid, proving that the Western economic model worked better, attracting countries globally to align with the West. NATO was primarily a military alliance, but had crucial economic components. The member countries had to coordinate their defense spending, had to purchase compatible weapons systems, had to integrate their military supply chains, and this created massive markets for American defense contractors, created standardization around American equipment and technology, and created dependencies where European militaries needed American spare parts and maintenance and upgrades, and NATO members had to maintain strong economies to afford defense spending, had to pursue growth-oriented policies, had to stay integrated with Western financial systems. So NATO membership wasn't just military commitment, it was economic commitment to the Western system, to the dollar-based order, to market economics. And this reinforced the financial architecture, ensured that America's most important allies were locked into the dollar system, couldn't defect to alternative economic models without leaving NATO and losing security guarantees. So the military and economic dimensions of the Cold War were inseparable, each reinforcing the other, and American strategists understood this clearly, saw economic integration as essential to military alliance. The development of the Eurodollar market in the 1950s was another key component. Eurodollars are dollars held in banks outside the United States, primarily in Europe, and this market emerged partly because the Soviet Union wanted to hold dollars for trade, but didn't want to keep them in American banks where they could be frozen or seized, and partly because European banks wanted to engage in dollar-denominated lending without American regulatory constraints, and American authorities allowed and even encouraged this market's development because it increased the international role of the dollar, made it even more essential to global finance, and the Eurodollar market became enormous, eventually holding trillions in dollar deposits and creating a shadow banking system outside any country's regulatory control. And this served American interests by making the dollar more deeply embedded in global finance, making it harder for countries to move away from the dollar because doing so would mean losing access to Eurodollar markets. And it also provided the Federal Reserve with additional monetary flexibility, the ability to influence global dollar liquidity through policies that affected the Eurodollar market. So what seemed like an offshore market outside American control was actually an extension of dollar hegemony. Another mechanism for ensuring that global finance ran on dollars and through American-influenced institutions. The petrodollar system established in the 1970s was perhaps the most brilliant financial move. After the collapse of Bretton Woods when Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971, There was risk that the dollar would lose its reserve currency status, that countries would diversify away from dollars into other currencies or into gold. But American diplomats negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other major oil producers where they would price oil exclusively in dollars and would invest their surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. And in exchange, America would provide military protection and support. And this created the petrodollar system, where any country that wanted to buy oil needed dollars. And since oil was essential to every modern economy, every country needed dollars, ensuring continued dollar demand even without gold backing. And the oil exporters' investment in U.S. Treasuries financed American deficits, allowed America to run trade deficits and government deficits without triggering dollar devaluation, because the dollars flowing out to buy oil came back as Treasury purchases. And this system persists today, though it's weakening as some oil producers accept other currencies and as renewable energy reduces oil dependence. But for decades, it was the foundation of dollar dominance. The mechanism that ensured the dollar remained the global reserve currency even after its link to gold was severed. The use of financial sanctions as Cold War weapon became increasingly sophisticated. The United States used its control over dollar clearing systems to punish countries that aligned with the Soviet Union, could freeze assets, could prevent transactions, could exclude countries from accessing dollar-based trade. And this was devastating because the dollar was essential to global commerce. Exclusion from dollar systems meant economic isolation, meant inability to import necessities or export goods, meant economic crisis, and the threat of sanctions influenced behavior. Countries that might have aligned with the Soviet Union often didn't, because the economic costs would be too high. And this financial coercion was more effective than military threats in many cases, was a form of warfare that didn't require firing a shot, but that could devastate economies and the infrastructure for financial sanctions. The dollar clearing systems and SWIFT and the correspondent banking networks, all of these were developed during the Cold War as tools of economic statecraft, as ways to punish enemies and reward friends, and they remain in use today, are perhaps more important now than during the Cold War because they've been refined and expanded, but their origins are in the deliberate construction of a financial system that gave America coercive power over other countries' economic choices. The IMF structural adjustment programs that became dominant in the 1980s were the culmination of this financial strategy. Developing countries that borrowed from the IMF were required to implement neoliberal reforms, privatize state enterprises, open to foreign investment, reduce government spending, deregulate markets. And these conditions served American and Western interests by opening markets for American corporations, by ensuring that developing countries' resources and assets could be purchased by foreign investors, by preventing state-led development models that might compete with Western capitalism. And the debt crisis of the 1980s, when many developing countries couldn't repay loans, gave the IMF enormous leverage, gave it the ability to impose these conditions on dozens of countries, effectively restructuring their economies to serve Western capital. And while this was presented as economic expertise, as the IMF helping countries develop through sound economic management, it was actually economic imperialism, was using debt and financial pressure to subordinate developing countries to Western interests, to prevent them from pursuing independent economic strategies. And this continues today. IMF conditions remain controversial, are criticized for imposing austerity and for serving creditor interests rather than debtor needs. But from the Cold War perspective, they were successful. They integrated countries into the Western economic system, prevented them from pursuing Soviet-aligned or non-aligned development strategies, and maintained Western and particularly American dominance over global economic architecture. The Soviet Union's exclusion from this financial system was deliberate and consequential. The Soviet bloc used different currencies, had different trade arrangements through Comecon. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance wasn't integrated into the dollar-based system, and this limited Soviet economic development, prevented them from accessing Western capital and technology except through barter or limited currency trades, prevented their allies from accessing Western markets and finance. And this created the stagnation and shortages that characterized Soviet bloc economies. They couldn't participate in the productivity gains and technological advances of the Western system, couldn't offer their citizens or allies the consumer abundance that Western capitalism provided. And this economic underperformance was crucial to the Cold War's outcome. It made communism unattractive, demonstrated capitalism's superiority in delivering material prosperity, and eventually contributed to the Soviet system's collapse. Gorbachev's reforms were driven partly by recognition that the Soviet economy couldn't compete, that integration with the Western financial system was necessary for development. But by the time he tried to reform, it was too late. The system was too rigid and too far behind, and the attempt to integrate with Western finance while maintaining political control failed, leading to the Soviet Union's dissolution. The Washington Consensus that emerged at the end of the Cold War was the victory declaration of this financial strategy. The consensus among Western policymakers and economists that market economics, privatization, deregulation, free trade, these were the only viable path to development, and that the Soviet model had been proven wrong, and countries worldwide accepted this consensus, adopted market reforms, opened their economies, joined the Western financial system, and this seemed to prove that the American financial strategy had succeeded completely, that there was no alternative to dollar-based capitalism, that the architecture created at Bretton Woods and extended through the Cold War was permanent. But this triumphalism was premature, because the financial system created to win the Cold War had vulnerabilities and contradictions that would become apparent later. The dollar's reserve currency status allowed America to run unsustainable deficits, accumulating debts that might eventually undermine confidence in the dollar. The IMF and World Bank's conditions created resentment in developing countries, created desire for alternatives to Western financial institutions. The use of financial sanctions created incentives for countries to develop alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar. And the 2008 financial crisis demonstrated that Western financial institutions weren't as well managed as they claimed, that the capitalist model had serious flaws, that the Washington Consensus wasn't infallible. The contemporary challenges to dollar hegemony, China's Belt and Road Initiative providing alternative development financing, the creation of the BRICS New Development Bank, attempts to conduct international trade in currencies other than the dollar, Russia and China's agreements to use rubles and yuan for bilateral trade, Iran and Venezuela attempting to circumvent sanctions through cryptocurrencies and alternative currencies. These are all responses to the financial system created during the Cold War, attempts to escape or reduce dependence on dollar-based architecture. And while the dollar remains dominant, remains essential to global trade and finance, the challenges are more serious than at any time since the system was created, because countries now have alternatives that didn't exist during the Cold War, because American use of sanctions has become so aggressive that countries fear being targeted, because confidence in American economic management has declined, and because the costs of dollar dependence, the need to hold dollar reserves, the exposure to American policy decisions, the vulnerability to sanctions, these are increasingly seen as outweighing the benefits, and this creates possibility that the financial architecture that won the Cold War might not survive the post-Cold War era, might be gradually eroded by countries diversifying away from dollars, creating alternative institutions, reducing their integration with American-controlled systems. The question of whether this financial plot was justified, whether using economic coercion and financial architecture to win the Cold War was morally acceptable, is complex and contested. Defenders would argue that the Soviet system was genuinely threatening, was totalitarian and expansionist, and that using every available tool, including financial tools to contain and ultimately defeat, it was justified. That the Bretton Woods system and the Marshall Plan and the other components of Western financial strategy created unprecedented prosperity, lifted billions out of poverty, enabled development that wouldn't have occurred under autarkic or Soviet-aligned systems, and that while there were costs and injustices, the overall outcome was positive. But critics would argue that the financial system was exploitative, was neocolonialism disguised as development assistance, that IMF conditions and structural adjustment programs impoverished millions while enriching Western corporations, that dollar hegemony allows America to export inflation and to impose its policy preferences on other countries without their consent, that the system was designed to benefit American and Western interests at others' expense, and that the prosperity it created was unevenly distributed, benefiting elites while leaving many worse off, and both perspectives have validity. The system did create unprecedented global prosperity and did defeat an oppressive alternative, but it also created dependencies and inequalities and gave America power over others' economic choices that was often used self-interestedly. The hidden financial plot behind the Cold War reveals that the current global economic order wasn't the result of natural economic forces or of neutral technical arrangements, but was deliberately designed by American and British planners to serve strategic purposes, to win an ideological and geopolitical struggle by using financial tools. And this design was remarkably successful, achieved its goals of defeating communism and establishing American economic leadership, but it was never fully disclosed, was never presented honestly to the American public or to the world as a strategy for American dominance. Instead, it was presented as creating stability and prosperity and development, as neutral technical institutions serving global needs, and this disguising of power as technocracy, of American hegemony as international cooperation, was part of the strategy, made the system more acceptable, made it easier to maintain, because countries couldn't openly oppose institutions that claimed to serve everyone's interests, couldn't be seen as opposing stability or development. So the financial plot succeeded partly through its hidden nature, through presenting American dominance as neutral global architecture, and understanding this history is important for understanding current conflicts, for recognizing that challenges to dollar hegemony or to IMF authority aren't just economic disputes, but are challenges to American power, are attempts to escape the financial architecture designed specifically to ensure American dominance, and that American resistance to these challenges isn't just about economics, but is about maintaining the strategic advantages that the Cold War financial system created, advantages that enabled victory then and that remain valuable now, making the hidden financial plot behind the Cold War not just historical interest, but an ongoing reality. A system designed 70 years ago to win a conflict that ended 30 years ago, but that persists. Because it serves powerful interests, because it's embedded in institutions and practices and dependencies that can't easily be changed, and because the beneficiaries of the system resist any fundamental restructuring even as the costs and contradictions become increasingly apparent to those subordinated to it.